It's all too common to get excited about something and jump on the bandwagon. I was a giddy teen when the Beanie Baby mania came out, with the promise that those little things were going to cost tens of thousands of pounds to the right collector years down the line. Nowadays the charity shops are full of them going for £1. I was lucky not to get swept up in that craze, as I much preferred to collect Digimon Digivices and Mighty Ducks merch. I'm glad too. Those Digivices and that merch have put on a few pounds, if you know what I mean. The railways, though, had its own mania, or what I like to call its Beanie Baby moment. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester line heralded a lot of firsts for the UK, and it promised so much more than just getting products from A to B. While it sent shockwaves among the canal movement industry, the turnpike and carriage companies at first thought that there was little to worry about. People were scared of these monstrous machines, and the local papers' interest in cartoons were only adding fuel to the fire. It also didn't help with William Huskinson's accident. But as the Liverpool and Manchester gained traction, more and more people began to trust the railway, and in turn, passenger movements by road slumped. The combined freight and now the increased passenger usage saw the railway's profits soar, and the investors were reaping the benefits. The success of the railway paved the way for other railways to be built, with investors desperate to replicate the Liverpool and Manchester's successes. Other railways would quickly follow, and it wasn't long before every large English town had a railway committee, each one committing to putting their own town on the railway map. In the city of York, the treasurer of the railway committee took his role more seriously than most. George Hudson, seeing the success and knowing that there was veritable gold mine on the tracks, and bought the majority of shares from the proposed line from York to Leeds. He had previously been in the town of Whitby, where a chance meeting with George Stephenson had set him up upon a daring idea. In 1835, he made a presentation to the York Railway Committee at the Guildhall with his plans. Instead of just having a line from York to Leeds, let it connect with the new lines Stephenson was building as well. This would allow passengers to travel from York to Derby for the first time. The idea was approved, and the committee transformed into the York and North Midland Railway Company. Hudson convinced Robert Stephenson to be its lead engineer in the York-Leeds project, and an Act of Parliament raised the needed capital. In 1836, Hudson was named chairman from the next committee meeting that was held. He was also an alderman, one of only 12 positions in the city, and was on the path to being elected mayor and, of course, Parliament. Meanwhile, across the country, momentum was building, but the economy was slowing down, and in response, interest rates were high. People were less inclined to invest in railways, but moved money into government bonds. Government bonds were a great investment at the time. They were safer and more secure than investing in railways, but people were keen to get things started, and while some projects were pushed through, it was at a steady and manageable pace. In York, while the poor went hungry, the influential wined and dined at the new Lord Mayor's grace. The brand new York and Leeds line was coming along nicely and partially open in some areas, and was on track to be connected to Normanton. But all was not well in the Hudson camp. He was vastly unpopular and had a sharp, cruel tongue. Leading the opposition was a man called George Leeming. He was a solicitor and rather vocal about his views on Hudson. By late 1839, although Hudson was hoping his railway achievements would keep him afloat, it couldn't save his job, and he was forced to step down in November. He also didn't go graciously. A thank you banquet was held in his honour, and Hudson was very keen to let his feelings know about his position. The whole thing ended up in a huge food fight spilling onto the streets of the Mansion House, with Hudson and others only being held back from coming to blows by their own drunkenness. The summer of 1840 was much more promising for both Hudson and for the economy. The North Midland Railway was complete, and thanks to Normanton connecting with both Derby and Rugby, commuters could go from York to London for the first time, taking a mere 10 hours. For context, a horse and carriage would take twice as long. York was getting a railway reputation and was perfectly poised for the boom which was to happen next. Hudson wanted to extend his reach northwards to Edinburgh, but there was a problem. The economy was recovering, but investors were still holding on to their money, and while the purse strings were loosening, simply weren't enough. Hudson had a plan to get the money. He advised at a meeting that the line from Darlington to Durham would be completed and then link up with existing routes to Newcastle and Gateshead. And to finance the £500,000, he would get 8 smaller companies that made up the interconnecting lines to supply the material to build and construct the line, and then offer shares in that new railway to their own respective shareholders. The purchased shares would be guaranteed a dividend of 6%, and the shareholders would each jointly own and administer the running of the line. The money spent on the shares and the running of the line would come back to both the railway and the shareholders. It was an ambitious plan. It also helped that the Midland Railway was doing exceptionally well compared to other similar-sized railways, and with it doing so well, few were willing to ask questions about the business dealings. In 1844, a new Railway Act was passed through Parliament. The Railway Regulation Act standardises a lot of how railways were set up, constructed and ran. It also made it easier for prospective railways to acquire land for the up-and-coming projects. It couldn't have come at a better time. The economy had turned, interest rates were down, and people were ready to invest. The rate of the return from the Midland Railway was nearing 10%, prompting others eager to start up as well. The Railway Act did, however, throw one caveat into the railway companies. Before any application would be considered before Parliament, the railway company had to raise at least 5% of its intended proposed capital. Although not directly responsible, the proposed companies decided to take a leaf out of Hudson's book, offer shares. But while Hudson had his application approved before throwing the shares to the investors, the proposed railways did not. Called scrip, proposed companies would offer shares to raise the initial sum. Then, if the application was approved, the shares would then be issued to the shareholders. It wasn't recommended. If anything went wrong, as the company was not a limited company yet, the investors were subject to unlimited liability. This is very, very risky, as the investors would be personally liable for all debt and business obligations. Using scrip also meant that the shares that were pre-purchased could not be legally traded until the application went through. The booming economy also meant that more people had access to money than ever. For the first time, the middle class had the means to buy shares. The majority of these people were unskilled with how the stock market worked and saw it as just a way to make money. The railway companies took advantage of this and would advertise scrip in local papers. Unrealistic promise of high returns were claimed, and the public, who were not used to how it worked or knew the risk, bought scrip in droves. Getting the 5% was now simple. So simple, in fact, that Parliament was awash with railway applications, and at one point over 1,200 applications were received. Parliament didn't help with the tide either. The majority of the MPs were rich landowners, and the railway going through their land would make or break them. In order to get the application they wanted approved, the MPs used a process called log rolling. It was an under-the-table exchange, and basically it's an agreement between MPs to approve each other's bills in return for benefits. It seems underhanded and can be considered unethical and undemocratic, but bills, including ones today, can be passed by log rolling. To help with the sudden onset of applications, the applications were split into groups of 113 and a committee was set up for each group. Every committee would seat 5 MPs and they would consider the applications. The MPs was chosen specifically to have no connection with the application, but the MPs were still able to influence the applications outside of the committee rooms. But what did this all mean for the average citizen? Between 1845 and 1847, Parliament approved hundreds of companies and nearly 8,600 miles of track. The railway network exploded almost 5-fold in length. The number of shares that are now be fulfilled allowed for 15 new stock exchanges to be created, and the railways was the main trade in these new and old markets. In 1845, the government made an amendment to the Railway Act, upping the initial capital from 5% to 10%, but this did little to deter companies. In fact, it attracted more investors. Back in York, George was riding high. His railways were still profitable and had recently pocketed a princely sum of £10,000 from his completed line from York to Scarborough. However, the Regulation Act was weighing heavier than he liked. Hudson took his views to Parliament, where he went head to head with none other than William Gladstone himself. In the end, Hudson won out and the bill was amended. It was watered down and it meant Hudson could run his companies almost unaltered. It also gave Hudson a taste of the House of Commons and the power he really truly could have. In the summer, Hudson oversaw the opening of the Newcastle and Darlington Railway. Its opening brought Hudson one step closer to the all-elusive destination of Edinburgh. The papers were awash of his achievements, and by now Hudson was a very rich man. He started to buy land. He bought estates for each of his sons to inherit, and he bought Loughborough Hall for both himself and to block George Leaming's plan for a railway through the land, just to stick it up to Leaming personally. 1844 wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The London and York Railway was formed by many of Hudson's rivals. The railway would propose a direct route to London via Peterborough and Doncaster. Hudson was incensed. If this act passed, it would bypass his longer route via Normanton. He took his concerns to the Midland directors and asked for £2.5 million to build his own lines to rival it. Such was Hudson's power, it was universally granted, and the money was sitting, not on the line, but in his own bank account. Having the money, not only did he manage to procure the Selby and Hull Railway, which had been a thorn in his side for many years, but he acquired lines between Birmingham, Gloucester and Bristol, all the while calling out the London and York Railway investors and directors of shady investment practices. He spent more time in Parliament than anywhere else, and many considered him a real contender for a seat. When the MP for Sunderland passed away, forcing a by-election, the voters were looking for new blood, and although Hudson had barely stepped foot into the city, he was elected. The following day, York held a lavish parade in his honour, celebrating their self-proclaimed king. Hudson wallowed in the attention. The railways were booming, he was in power, and his rivals were quashed. He had everything he ever wanted. What could possibly go wrong?